This lecture, Capitalism, the Cure for Racism, was originally delivered in New York City in the winter of 1972.
Now let us begin. A gross inequality exists in the United States between the economic level of the average Negro and that of the average white. Andrew F. Brimmer of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System writes in the August 1970 issue of Ebony magazine, quote, "While Negroes constitute 11% of the population of the United States, they receive only about 6.5% of the personal income, and they own less than 2% of the assets held by households," unquote. Because the United States is viewed as a fundamentally capitalist country, this inequality is often blamed on the nature of capitalism. And as a result, capitalism is frequently denounced as a system of economic exploitation of Negroes. I will refute the following major accusations commonly made against capitalism. 1. Under capitalism, Negro workers are paid less than whites for the identical work. 2. The skills and abilities of Negro workers are not utilized. That is, Negroes are arbitrarily shunted into low-skilled, low-paying jobs or into unemployment. 3. Negroes must pay higher rents than whites for the same or even inferior housing, and higher prices for the same or even inferior goods. And while they do so, they must suffer the indignity of racial segregation. For example, they must live in separate neighborhoods, eat in separate restaurants, ride in the back of the bus, use separate washrooms, and so forth. The basis of these accusations is what Ayn Rand would call an intellectual package deal. Namely, capitalism is associated with the United States. The history of the United States, including the history of the most recent years, is also associated with a record of injustices committed against Negroes. Hence, it is concluded, capitalism is guilty of the above accusations. The conclusion is obviously a non sequitur. My theme is that the above accusations are absolutely incorrect insofar as they are leveled against capitalism, and that to the extent they are correct as descriptions of past or present conditions in the United States, the cause of the injustices is a violation of the principles of capitalism. Far from being the source of such injustices, capitalism is the remedy for them. Let us understand the nature of capitalism. By capitalism, I mean uncontrolled, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. That is, an economic system in which each individual is free to act peaceably to achieve his own gain. Capitalism is a system in which businessmen, in their capacity as employers and as sellers, are free to do whatever they consider to be most profitable to themselves. Wage earners and consumers, by the same token, are free to seek the highest wages and lowest prices they can find. The only restriction on the parties is that they are not to resort to physical force or to fraud, which is a species of force. At the same time, their freedom to act to achieve their own gain means that they are not to be the victims of the initiation of physical force. Each businessman, wage earner, and consumer under capitalism is free from the initiation of physical force, both by other private individuals or groups and by government itself. Government under capitalism is the individual's protector against all private force and does not itself initiate any force against him. What this means is that the government uses the police and the jails against criminals, against men who have committed such acts as murder, robbery, rape, etc., and only against criminals, not against innocent men who have not committed such acts. Government under capitalism does not threaten the individual in any way with jail terms, fines, or any other penalty for any action on his part other than an act of physical force. Thus, the government under capitalism is virtually a night watchman, and the peaceful citizen hardly notices its presence. Capitalism has obviously never existed fully in the United States. Even in the 19th century, it was mixed with conflicting elements of government controls. And for the American Negro, capitalism has never existed even as an approximation. Slavery, the forced labor of one man for the benefit of another, was the diametrical opposite of capitalism. The mixture of capitalism with controls has greatly accelerated in this century, to the point where it has long since ceased to be correct to describe the economic system of capitalism, to describe the economic system of the United States as capitalism in any sense. The present system is not even semi-capitalism. It is more controlled and regulated than it is free. I call it the mixed economy welfare state. My purpose in this speech tonight is twofold. First, to show how, if it did exist, capitalism would operate to eliminate all elements of the economic inequality of Negroes in comparison to whites. And second, to show what are the specific features of the mixed economy welfare state which constitute forcible obstacles to the advancement of Negroes and which would have to be repealed to make possible their advancement under capitalism. Let us begin with the accusation that under capitalism, Negroes are paid less than whites for the identical work. Such injustice is contrary to the operation of the profit motive and is speedily eliminated where the profit motive is free to operate. Under the profit motive, if two kinds of labor are equally good and one is less expensive than the other, employers choose the less expensive because doing so cuts their costs and raises their profits. The effect of choosing the less expensive labor, however, is to raise its wage rates, since it is now in greater demand, while the effect of passing by the more expensive labor is to reduce its wages, since it is now in lesser demand. This process goes on until the wages of the two kinds of labor are either perfectly equal or the remaining difference is so small as not to be worth caring about by anyone. As illustration of the fact that even very small differences in wages could not be maintained under capitalism, consider the following example. Assume that white workers of a certain degree of skill are paid $2 per hour. Assume that Negro workers of identically the same degree of skill can be hired for just 5% less. That is, for just 10 cents an hour less. Assume that a factory must employ 500 workers of this degree of skill. With a 40-hour week over a 50-week year, this slight difference in hourly wage rates results in a saving of labor cost and a corresponding extra profit per year of $100,000 if the factory owner employs 500 Negroes rather than 500 whites. For 10 cents times 500 times 40 times 50 equals $100,000. Even in the case of a small establishment employing only 10 workers, the annual saving in labor cost, and thus the extra profit attaching to the employment of Negroes, would be $2,000. since 10 cents times 10 times 40 times 50 equals $2,000. Enough for the owner to afford a new small car each year or to make significant improvements in his business. It is doubtful if there are many employers so bigoted as to be willing to indulge their personal prejudice in favor of whites at a cost of $100,000 per year, or even $2,000 per year. The clear implication is that even slight differences in wage rates would make the employment of Negroes in preference to whites virtually irresistible. Not only would a 5% differential in wages not be sustainable, but neither would a 2% or even a 1% differential. Every such differential would lead employers to hire Negroes in preference to whites, and would thus bring about a further rise in the wages of Negroes and a further fall in the wages of whites until a virtually perfect equality was achieved. Indeed, profit-seeking employers, qua profit-seeking employers, are simply unconcerned with race. Their principle is, of two equally good workers, hire the one who is available for less money. Of two workers available for the same money, hire the one who is the better worker. Race is simply irrelevant. Any consideration of race means extra cost and less profit. It is bad business in the literal sense of the term. It should be realized that one of the great merits of capitalism is that by its very nature, employers are virtually compelled to be oblivious to race. The freedom of competition under capitalism ensures this result. For even if, initially, the majority of employers were so fanatically bigoted as to be willing to forego extra profits for the sake of their prejudice, they would be powerless to prevent a minority of more rational employers from earning these extra profits. The more rational employers would thus have a relatively greater income from which to save and expand their businesses than the irrational majority. Moreover, since they operated at lower costs, they could afford to charge lower prices and thus increase their profits still further by taking customers away from the irrational majority. The result of these factors would be that the more rational employers would tend to replace the less rational ones in economic importance. They would come to set the tone of the economy, and their attitudes would be transmitted to all other employers who would seek to emulate their success. In this way, capitalism virtually guarantees the victory of rationality over racial bigotry, even when it must begin in a thoroughly bigoted culture, for then it acts to change the culture. Our discussion provides the answer to the second accusation, the charge that under capitalism, the skills and abilities of Negro workers are not utilized. It follows from our discussion that the unhampered profit motive leads employers to place Negroes in the highest positions for which their skills and abilities qualify them. Consider the following example. Assume that a skilled lathe operator must be paid $4 per hour, and that Negro workers who have been taught this skill in a trade school are presently employed as janitors at $1.50 per hour. The Negro workers would almost certainly be willing to change their jobs for a raise to, say, $1.75 an hour. Any employer who hired them as lathe operators at $1.75 per hour would thereby add $2.25 to his profits for every hour of their work as compared with employing whites. Over the course of a year composed of 50 40-hour weeks, his extra profit would amount to $4,500, and this would be on the labor of just one man. It is obvious that under capitalism, if the skills and abilities of Negroes are being wasted, in low-skilled, low-paying jobs, it is to the financial self-interest of employers to change the situation. Indeed, to seek out such Negroes, and in many cases, even to incur substantial costs in training them. And it follows that the greater the extent to which a Negro's skill or ability is wasted, the greater is the profit to be made by rectifying the situation. For example, if a Negro with the ability to do the work of a $50,000 a year company vice president is working as a $5,000 a year file clerk, it is even more to the interest of an employer to seek him out and rectify the situation than in the case of the lathe operator working as a janitor. In this case, the employer could triple the Negro worker's salary to $15,000 and at the same time add $35,000 to his own profits by employing him in a capacity commensurate with his ability. Of course, just as in the initial case, the wages and salaries of Negroes brought into the more skilled and higher level jobs would very quickly come to match those of the white workers performing these jobs. Because as employers competed for Negroes, their wages would rise, while in order to be competitive with the Negro workers, the white workers would have to accept reductions. The free operation of the profit motive on the part of employers and of the desire of wage earners to increase their incomes would eliminate Negro and white unemployment, thus rectifying whatever non-utilization of Negro skills results from unemployment. When workers are unemployed and receiving no incomes, it is to their interest to offer to work for less than workers holding jobs, and it is to the interest of employers to take advantage of the situation. Because unemployed workers can be hired for less, employers are in a position to make their present workers accept lower wages in order not to be replaced. However, as wages fall, the same total funds expended in employing labor can employ more labor. In other words, what appears to be a competition for a given number of jobs has the effect of expanding the number of jobs. For example, if $400 billion is the aggregate payment of wages in an economy, these $400 billion can employ 40 million workers at an average wage of $10,000, or 50 million workers at an average wage of $8,000, or any number at the appropriate average wage. The general formula is that the number which can be employed equals the aggregate wages paid divided by the average wage per worker. Under capitalism, free competition makes the average wage per worker go to the point where there is full employment. It cannot go lower because then employers would be offering more jobs than there were workers to fill them. Thus, Negro unemployment under capitalism is self-liquidating because its existence makes the unemployed workers and the employers take actions which eliminate it. Parenthetically, for reasons to be presented, it should not be assumed that the fall in wages required to eliminate Negro unemployment, or unemployment generally, implies a fall in the standard of living of wage earners. It does not. Given the present injustices against the Negro worker, the adoption of capitalism and free competition in the labor market clearly would result in a reduction in the wages of the average white. 2 points must be realized concerning this reduction. First, it would be proportionately far less than the rise in the wages of the average Negro. This follows primarily from the fact that white workers outnumber Negro workers so heavily, and to a lesser extent, from the very fact that the wages of the average white are initially higher than those of the average Negro, and thus their change is to be calculated on a higher base. As illustration, assume that white workers outnumber Negro workers by 9 to 1, which approximates the actual ratio. Assume further that initially the wages of the average Negro are no more than half those of the average white, counting unemployed Negroes as earning 0 wages. This relationship also approximates the actual one. These assumptions can be concretized by imagining that for every Negro who earns $5 in wages, there are 9 whites, each of whom earns $10 in wages in the same period of time. Now observe that the total aggregate wages of all 10 workers combined in this example is $95, and that the average wage is $9.50. If free competition were to bring about a full equalization of white and Negro wages, which it would do if the composition of white and Negro skills were equal, it would mean that the wages of the average Negro would rise from $5 to $9.50, while the wages of the average white would fall from $10 to $9.50. Thus, while the wages of the Negro would rise by 90%, the wages of the white would fall by a mere 5%. Now, this description of matters would be sufficient if it were the case simply that Negroes worked alongside whites, performed exactly the same labor, and yet received less money. Then all that would occur with the establishment of free competition would be a change in wages, as described. But the fact is that the cases in which Negroes receive less money for the identical work are comparatively rare, at least outside of the South. What brings down the earnings of Negroes is that they are shunted into low-skilled jobs or forced into unemployment, or, for a variety of reasons to be discussed, simply never develop their talents. Thus, it is not simply that their earnings are less, but also, and more fundamentally, that their contribution to production is forcibly held down in comparison to that of white workers. The establishment of free competition, therefore, would bring about an increase in the contribution to production on the part of Negro workers. This brings us to the second and far more important point concerning the reduction in white wages, namely, that it would be accompanied by a reduction in commodity prices and in taxation, which would more than make up for it. Thus, even though free competition with Negroes would reduce the money earned by the average white worker, it would nevertheless raise his standard of living. It would enable him to buy more with his lower wages than he previously could buy with his higher wages. The underlying principle here is that one man's gain resulting from an increase in production is not another man's loss. Where men gain money income as a result of increasing their production in competition with others, as do the Negro workers in this case, they simultaneously act to reduce commodity prices by virtue of offering an increased production on the market. The rise in their money incomes and the fall in commodity prices are different aspects of the same thing. And it must work out that the fall in commodity prices caused by their increased production is in proportion to the money income which they compete away from the rest of the economic system, in this case, to the fall in wages of the white workers. Thus, in our previous example, in which the wages of the average white worker fell from $10 to $9.50, commodity prices would also fall by 5%. To understand why commodity prices, as well as the wages of whites, would fall by 5%, we need only trace the implications of the assumption that the Negro's gains are the result of an increase in his production. Thus, assume that initially the average Negro produced 1 unit of output while the average white produced 2, and that it was for this reason that the Negro earned only $5 while the white earned $10. Now assume that with the freedom of competition, the Negro doubles his production to equality with the average white, and that it is for this reason that both earn the same wage of $9.50. Observe, if the Negro now produces 2 units of output instead of 1, and 9 whites go on producing a total of 18 units of output, the combined output of the Negro and the whites together rises from 19 units to 20 units. Now, an increase in supply on the order of 20 to 19 acts to reduce commodity prices to a level of 19/20ths of their initial height, or by 5%, the same as the reduction in the wages of the white workers. Thus, the doubling of the Negro workers' output is responsible for an equal fall both in commodity prices and in the wages of whites. In fact, the Negro's gain would actually be the white man's gain. The standard of living of the average white worker would actually be increased. There are 2 reasons why this would be the result. First, to the extent that the larger output on the part of Negroes was the result of a reduction in Negro unemployment, there would be fewer Negroes on relief. This would make possible a reduction in the taxes of the white worker. The white worker would earn less money and buy at correspondingly lower prices, and he could keep a larger proportion of what he earned. This would represent a net gain to him. For example, instead of earning $100 per week and having to pay $5 a week in taxes for the support of unemployed Negroes, the white worker would now earn $95 a week, buy at prices 95% of what they were, and not have to pay these taxes. Second, to the extent that the larger output on the part of the Negroes was the result of their exercising skills and abilities which they had previously been prevented from exercising, the effect would be not only an increase in production on the part of Negroes, but also on the part of whites. This follows from the fact that to the extent that those in the higher positions in the economy are better qualified, the men under them produce more. Thus, for example, if there are Negroes who can be better foremen, engineers, plant managers, and vice presidents than some of the whites now occupying these positions, the effect of Negroes obtaining these positions would not only be a rise in their own output, but a rise in the output of the white workers who would be under them. The white workers would produce more because they would work under better direction. This further rise in output would make commodity prices fall in greater degree than the wages of the white workers. And this, of course, would represent a net gain to the white workers. The phenomenon of workers in lower positions being able to produce more as a result of an improvement in the men in the higher positions is an application of Ayn Rand's principle of the pyramid of ability. Thus, in sum, free competition in the labor market is not only just, but it is also in the economic self-interest of the average white worker. Laissez-faire capitalism would supply Negroes with housing and all other goods on the same terms as whites. To understand why this would be so, one need only assume that it were not so, and then observe the operation of the profit motive. Thus, as a demonstration, assume that Negroes had to pay monthly rents just 5% higher than whites, while the landlord's costs were the same in both cases. This 5% premium would constitute a major addition to the landlord's profits. If a landlord's profit margin, his profit as a percentage of his rents, were normally 10%, a 5% addition to his rents would constitute a 50% addition to his profits. Even if his profit margin were initially as high as 25%, a 5% addition to his rents would constitute a 20% addition to his profits. In response to such premium rates of profit, housing construction for Negroes would be stepped up, and a larger proportion of existing housing would be rented to them. The effect of this increased supply of housing, of course, would be to reduce the rental premium paid by Negroes. And because a mere 1% premium would mean significant extra profits in supplying Negroes with housing, even a premium of this small size could not be maintained. Thus, Negroes would pay no higher rents and obtain housing equally as good as whites. Likewise, assume that merchants in Negro neighborhoods charged higher prices than the same goods would bring in other neighborhoods, while the merchants' costs of doing business were the same in both places. The higher prices in such a case would constitute a clear addition to profits. With higher profits to be made in Negro neighborhoods than white neighborhoods, merchants considering the location of new stores would choose the Negro neighborhoods. The influx of new stores, of course, would lower selling prices in Negro neighborhoods, and the process would go on until the prices and the profits to be made in those neighborhoods were no higher than elsewhere. It is worth noting that supermarkets in particular, which are frequently criticized for charging higher prices in Negro areas, would be among the first to reduce their prices to the level of other neighborhoods. For the profit margins of supermarkets are normally less than 2% of their sales revenues. In the case of supermarkets, therefore, prices and profit margins only 1% higher would mean a rate of profit in excess of 50% higher. This would be an extremely powerful inducement to the opening of new supermarkets in Negro neighborhoods and to immediate price reductions to forestall their opening. Thus, in retailing as in real estate, businessmen seeking profit would quickly see to it that Negroes were supplied on the same terms as whites. Moreover, under laissez-faire capitalism, racial segregation would disappear, even though it would be legally permissible on private property. It would disappear because it is fundamentally incompatible with the requirements of profit-making and because it is irrational. The businessman seeking profit is vitally dependent on the patronage of customers. This dependency is expressed in such popular sayings as, "The customer is king and the customer is always right." Negroes are customers, and as they rose economically, would be more and more important customers. It is absurd to believe that businessmen would want to turn customers away by denying them access to their premises or by humiliating them with such requirements as separate drinking fountains. The businessman's desire for profit makes him put aside all such malice. It does not matter that he personally may not like Negroes. All he has to like is their money. Competition with other businessmen for the patronage of Negroes then does the rest. It might be objected that despite the willingness of businessmen to abolish segregation when doing so is profitable, the attitudes of white customers would prevent it from being profitable. For example, it would obviously not be profitable to gain 5 poor Negro customers and lose 10 good white ones as a result of desegregating. Cases such as this could exist, especially in the Deep South, but they could only exist in an ever-diminishing sphere. Even in the Deep South, there are many whites who positively desire equal treatment for Negroes, and many, many more who do not oppose it strongly enough to withdraw their patronage from a business which desegregated. As a result, there would be many businessmen in the South who would find that while they might lose some white customers by desegregating, they would by no means lose all, and would gain more Negro customers than they lost whites. This would be certain to occur in areas where the population was both relatively concentrated, that is, lived in cities or large towns, and in which the proportion of Negroes was relatively high. In such areas, a businessman who desegregated would be able to count on a relatively large Negro market to more than compensate him for the loss of white customers. For example, imagine a Southern 5 and 10 in an area where there are 2 other 5 and 10s. If the 5 and 10 abolishes segregation, it will certainly not lose all of its white customers. Not that many Southern whites are so irrational that they will refuse to shop at the 5 and 10 because it no longer humiliates Negroes. Desegregating, however, will enable this 5 and 10 to gain a large number of Negro customers from the other 2 5 and 10s, for the Negroes will flock to where they are treated as human beings. Desegregation would thus be profitable for this 5 and 10. This case would be repeated throughout the South. From practically the first day of capitalism, there would be voluntarily unsegregated 5 and 10s, restaurants, hotels, etc., etc. The existence of these unsegregated establishments in their midst would then act to change the attitude even of those whites who had initially refused to deal with them. They would see with their own eyes that others were not contaminated by contact with Negroes, and that they would not be either. Thus, as time went on, fewer and fewer whites would be prepared to withdraw their business from establishments which desegregated. The result would be that businessmen would have less and less to lose by desegregating. And the rising earning power, and thus the growing buying power of Negroes, would give them more and more to gain. Finally, segregation would be regarded as eccentric and then cease to exist altogether. In this way, even such barriers as racially restrictive covenants in real estate would be overcome. Property free of such restrictions would become more valuable than property which carried them. Such covenants would fall into disuse and be eliminated by voluntary consent. Thus, even in areas as backward as the deepest South, the introduction of capitalism would mean a significant measure of immediate integration, followed by an accelerating growth in integration. And it would all be achieved voluntarily in the pursuit of self-interest, in a spirit of mutual goodwill. In view of all of the preceding discussion, why is it that Negroes have continued to be the victims of racial prejudice in the United States? Why haven't Negroes long since been assimilated to the point of full equality with everyone else? The answer is that Negroes have never lived under a capitalist economic system in the United States. In order to understand why this has been the case, it is necessary to understand something about the history of the geographical distribution of the Negro population in this country. Thus, according to the 1971 World Almanac, quote, the Negroes' distribution over the past 50 years but especially during the past 25 years, has changed radically from a concentration of the great majority in the rural South to urban centers in substantially every part of the nation, unquote. The significance of this fact is very great. What it means, in essence, is that where capitalism existed, the Negroes were not present. And by the time they got there, it was gone. Let me explain. From the end of the Civil War in 1865 until shortly before World War I, the northern United States enjoyed an economic system which was an approximation to capitalism, although a diminishing one. But in this period, almost all of the Negroes continued to live in the South, where the economic system contained major elements of statism and feudalism, both of which were directed against them and which survive to this day. In the South, any businessman who tried to take advantage of the lower wage rates of Negroes, or who dared to desegregate his establishment, had to fear physical force, both on the part of his state and local government and on the part of private individuals. For example, state and local government officials, acting under arbitrary laws backed by the threat of fines or jail terms, could decide to find health, safety, or fire hazards on his premises, to raise the tax appraisal of his property, or to revoke or deny a needed license or permission, thereby imposing additional costs on him and perhaps threatening him with financial ruin. If the action of the government officials was not enough, there was the ever-present threat of night riders, who might inflict physical harm on the businessman or on members of his family, or who could damage or destroy his place of business. And of course, the Negro workers or customers of such a businessman would have had to fear similar consequences. Starting in the years prior to World War I, the whole country began to move away from capitalism at an accelerated rate. The federal government, and to a lesser extent the state and local governments in both the North and the South, adopted an ever-increasing array of government controls and regulations. By the 1930s, after the implementation of the policies of President Hoover and then of the so-called New Deal of President Roosevelt, the economic system of the North had become far removed from that of capitalism. Instead, the economic system of the North and of the whole country had become a mixed economy welfare state. Thus, by the time the Great Migration of Negroes to the North took place during World War II and the generation following, a very different kind of economy awaited them than had awaited the European immigrants of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Under the mixed economy welfare state into which they moved, Negroes have been deprived of many of the benefits they would have received from the unhampered operation of the profit motive. And in addition, they have been made to bear other burdens and suffer other ill effects which result from the general policy of the mixed economy welfare state of attempting to impose sacrifices on some men for the benefit of others. The mixed economy welfare state at the federal level and in the North is not motivated by a desire to suppress Negroes. That is not its conscious intention, but that is its effect. It is its effect by virtue of policies carried out against businessmen and against taxpayers. Among the aspects of the mixed economy welfare state most relevant to the present discussion, and which I will consider in turn, are anti-profit legislation and business timidity, pro-union legislation, minimum wage legislation, public welfare laws, child labor legislation, rent control, public housing, and urban renewal. It must be obvious that all legislation which reduces the incentive of businessmen to earn profits, thereby reduces their incentive to bring justice to Negroes. The most extreme form of such legislation is the limitation of the height of profit to some prescribed maximum, such as a fixed percentage of a given capital base. In such cases, there is simply no incentive to increase profits above the prescribed amount because all additional profits will be taken away. There are numerous examples of industries whose profits are controlled in this way in the mixed economy welfare state. Among them are all public utilities and all defense contractors. In addition, other firms not necessarily subject to formal control, such as those in the steel and automobile industries, know that they must keep their profits within certain limits in order not to become the target of governmental hostility, which could result in antitrust suits or special legislative action against them. Besides such controls on profit, there is the taxation of profit under both the corporate income tax and the personal income tax. Between the two, it has not been uncommon for a businessman to be faced with the prospect of having to pay as much as 85 cents of each additional dollar of profit in the form of taxes. This has been the case if he has had to pay a corporate income tax of approximately 50% and then has wanted to take the remaining 50% in the form of a dividend and has had the misfortune to be in the top bracket of the personal income tax. In that case, after paying the corporate income tax, he has had to look forward in recent years to having to pay as much as 70% of the remaining 50% under the personal income tax. And the personal income tax has even been significantly higher. Such rates of taxation, of course, greatly reduce the incentive to earn additional profit. Anti-profit legislation is clearly the enemy of every Negro. It weakens and in many cases completely thwarts his most powerful and most reliable ally, the businessman's motivation of financial self-interest. Anti-profit legislation must be viewed in conjunction with the general climate of uncertainty and timidity which prevails among businessmen in a mixed economy welfare state. In the mixed economy welfare state, a businessman cannot calculate the future financial consequences of many of his actions. At any time, he may become the victim of a costly strike or of a new government regulation, or he may be deprived of a lucrative government contract. Whether or not he will suffer in this way, or the extent to which he will suffer, is determined by the good or ill will of anonymous individuals, anonymous union members, anonymous government officials, and even anonymous members of the general public. The businessman in the mixed economy welfare state becomes fearful of offending anyone. He fears doing anything, quote, controversial. This fear applies to actions which are of benefit to Negroes. The fear would be overcome by a sufficiently high rate of profit, but it is this which anti-profit legislation prevents. The mixed economy welfare state makes businessmen fear the incurrence of penalties while at the same time depriving them of the prospect of rewards. This combination stops businessmen from initiating changes which would be of benefit to Negroes. It enables such things as sheer inertia and the desire not to ruffle the sensibilities of some of their white workers to outweigh the economies of pursuing a just policy toward Negro workers. As a result of pro-union legislation, such as the Wagner Act and the Norris-LaGuardia Act, employers are compelled to pay wage rates in accordance with union scales. these wage rates are higher than would prevail in the absence of the unions. For the main reason for the existence of labor unions is to secure higher wages. As a result of having to pay these higher wages, however, the number of workers which employers in the unionized fields can afford to employ is reduced. For employers, like consumers, have only a limited quantity of money at their disposal, and the higher the wages of any species of labor, like the higher the price of any good, the less of it they can afford to buy. Moreover, higher wages mean that the employer's costs are higher, which necessitates higher selling prices, which in turn means that a smaller quantity of the product can be sold, and thus that a smaller quantity of labor is needed to produce it. For either or both of these reasons, the effect of employers being compelled to deal with labor unions is to create a scarcity of jobs. There are fewer jobs in the unionized fields than there are workers capable of performing them. Given such an artificial job scarcity, some potential workers must be excluded. And given the existing degree of prejudice against Negroes, Negroes happen to be an easy and convenient group to exclude. The further effect of the job scarcities created by labor unions is to compel the workers who otherwise would have been employed in the unionized fields to crowd into other fields. The wages in these other fields are lower to begin with. Otherwise, the excluded workers would have chosen them in the first place. And they are reduced still further by having to absorb the workers excluded from the unionized fields. For example, if truck drivers and carpenters must be paid wage rates above the free market level, there will be fewer employment opportunities for such workers. Men who would have been truck drivers or carpenters will have to crowd into other less remunerative fields, such as doing day labor, being a waiter, and so on. And now the wage rates in these fields will be depressed by the influx of this larger supply of labor. The fact that large numbers of Negroes are involved in this artificial shift of labor from higher to lower paying fields, and that the differentials between the fields are artificially increased in the process, is a major factor accounting for the significantly lower level of income received by the average Negro family in comparison with the average white family. Observe, under laissez-faire capitalism, this state of affairs could not exist. Employers in the unionized fields would hire non-union Negroes until their wage rates were equal to those of the unionized whites. What stops this from happening, apart from the factors already considered, is that under the present mixed economy welfare state, the National Labor Relations Board would levy vast financial penalties against any employer who tried it. And while the law stood aside, the labor unions involved would be free to resort to violence and intimidation against him and against the Negro workers he brought in. The existence of such an unjust system, of course, frequently discourages Negroes from acquiring the qualifications needed for the better paying jobs in the first place. To the superficial observer, it can then appear that Negroes are in lower paying jobs simply because they are not qualified for anything better. Like pro-union legislation, minimum wage laws also raise wage rates artificially and cause employers to employ less labor. However, inasmuch as these laws apply to almost all employments, there is no place for the displaced workers to go. Thus, these workers are forced into unemployment and onto welfare rolls. The impact of the minimum wage laws is greatest on the least educated, least skilled segment of the population. For this is the segment which earns the lowest wage rates and whose wage rates are increased by the minimum wage laws. Accordingly, it is this segment which suffers the unemployment resulting from them. Since Negroes comprise a disproportionately large element of this segment, they suffer a disproportionately large share of the unemployment. Negro teenagers in particular, having been taught little or nothing in the public schools and lacking in previous work experience, bear the worst brunt of the minimum wage laws. According to the New York Times of June 18, 1971, their unemployment rate was in excess of 30%. This compared with an overall unemployment rate of less than 6%. Thus, while pro-union legislation acts to reduce the wage rates of Negroes relatively to whites by shunting them into lower-skilled, lower-paying fields, the minimum wage laws act in a more extreme way and reduce the earnings of Negroes all the way to zero. Minimum wage legislation and pro-union legislation together operate in a kind of tandem. On the one hand, the displacement of labor from the unionized fields to the non-union fields widens the sphere in which the minimum wage laws are effective, for it acts to depress wage rates in these fields and thus to reduce a larger number of wage rates below the legally prescribed minimum. On the other hand, in forcibly preventing the existence of wage rates below the legally prescribed minimum, the minimum wage laws close the gates, as it were, against a part of the supply of labor spilling over from the unionized fields, and cause that labor either to be unemployed or to displace an equivalent supply of labor which must be unemployed. It should be observed that both minimum wage and pro-union legislation have a further long-term depressing effect on the income of Negroes. They prevent, or at least greatly retard, subsequent advancement. For example, the Negro teenagers who are victimized by the minimum wage laws lose the opportunity to acquire knowledge and skills through work. They thus lose the opportunity of being able to qualify for higher-paying jobs later on. In this way, the minimum wage laws not only cause them to be unemployed, but to be fit for only the lowest skilled work. Similarly, the pro-union legislation acts to arrest Negro advancement. For example, the Negro who is prevented from working in a plant is not likely ever to become a foreman or manager there. The Negro who is prevented from being a workman in the construction industry has no hope of ever becoming a construction contractor. The public welfare system not only serves as a refuge for those who are unemployed as a result of minimum wage and pro-union legislation, but as an additional independent source of unemployment, over and above that caused by minimum wage and pro-union legislation. For it makes it possible for many people who could earn a modest income by working to obtain a commensurate income without working. In this way, it induces men to lose the opportunity of acquiring in low-paying jobs the knowledge, skill, and experience which might later qualify them for higher-paying jobs. It thus exercises a lifelong depressing effect on them by keeping them out of work and by thus limiting their abilities to the lowest skilled kinds of work. In proportion to their number, Negroes are the greatest victims of the welfare laws. The reason is that as a result of historical factors perpetuated by the mixed economy welfare state, they begin in an inferior position in which a disproportionate number of them are among the holders of the kind of low-paying jobs with which welfare allowances are competitive. Thus, a larger proportion of Negroes than of whites is induced to seek welfare allowances. The welfare system is a major and growing burden on the Negro taxpayer as well as on the white taxpayer. And with every increase in the burden, the difference between the rewards of working and the penalties of not working are diminished. And thus the welfare rolls swell further. The result is a system which begins to grow by virtue of its own previous growth, with national bankruptcy the only logical resting place. The welfare system is self-perpetuating from one generation to the next. For children grow up in an environment in which they perceive no connection between work and income, or between effort and reward, and in which they would probably be resented for desiring such a connection. It should not be surprising that many of them grow up mentally inert and incapable of performing much beyond the lowest skilled work. What the welfare system inculcates and transmits is, in fact, a psychology very similar to that of slaves. For a slave, there was also no connection between work and income or between effort and reward, which is why slaves tended to be mentally inert. The one important difference is that under slavery, physical force was employed against the slaves. Under the welfare system, physical force is employed against the taxpayers, who must work as slaves in order to permit the welfare recipients not to work. Public welfare provides the explanation of the grain of truth in such assertions as that of Malcolm X. Quote, "For these run-down apartment dwellings, the black man in Harlem pays more money than the man down in the rich Park Avenue section. It costs us more money to live in the slums than it costs them to live down on Park Avenue," unquote. If this statement were reworded to say that the rents charged for some Negro families on welfare and living at hotels are higher than those paid by many people on Park Avenue, it would be correct. According to the New York Times of November 24th, 1970, the rents of such families have been as high as $1,200 per month. It is grossly unjust, however, to imply that Negro working families are being arbitrarily gouged by racist landlords and are thus the victims of, quote, capitalistic exploitation, unquote, which is the implication of that quotation. That implication is simply a lie. As I have shown, under capitalism, Negroes would not pay higher rents than whites for the same quality housing. But under a system of public welfare, if one compares the rents of Negro families on welfare with those of white families not on welfare, enormous disparities can exist. The reason is that the rents of the welfare families are paid out of tax revenues. The government officials involved, who must approve the rents, do not bear the financial burden of them. Thus, they are not concerned how high the rents go. Moreover, since the government officials involved are also not the ones who must live in the places for which they approve the rents, they have no personal interest in the living conditions there. Thus, not only can the rents be enormous, but the living conditions can be those of absolute squalor at the same time. So-called child labor legislation prevents large numbers of adolescents who are willing and able to work from working. I say adolescents because it is doubtful that many children below the age of 13 or 14 would want to work in a serious way, and at the present level of economic development, it is doubtful that many families with children below that age would feel any need to ask them to. Negroes comprise a disproportionately large number of these adolescents. in part because their parents tend to be less able to provide them with money for dates and similar expenses, and in part because the compulsory tax-supported educational system has even less to offer them than it does to white adolescents, with the result that a proportionately larger number of them wish to leave school and work full-time. Forcibly preventing these young people from going to work not only denies them the chance to earn money, but much more importantly, it prevents them from acquiring knowledge, skill, and experience of work, which would be of economic benefit to them in later life. At a time in life when they are most receptive to learning work skills and forming good work habits, the child labor laws compel them to be idle. The compulsory idleness resulting from the child labor laws, and for the majority of Negro teenagers, the corollary of compulsory poverty, coupled in so many cases with the frustrations of compulsory school attendance, add up to a situation in which large-scale juvenile delinquency is not difficult to understand. The child labor laws are not an aid to education, as is often believed. On the contrary, to the extent that they keep students in school who have no interest in learning, their effect is to reduce the level and quality of education for all. And it should be noted that under a system of voluntary private education, child labor laws would stand in the way of education in a second respect. They would prevent students from earning a part of their tuition money, which might be necessary in the case of poorer families. The mixed economy welfare state not only holds the Negro back in his capacity as an income earner, but also in his capacity as a consumer. It, not capitalism, bears responsibility for the squalid living conditions in which many Negroes must live, for the squalid conditions in which many Negroes must live. Pro-union legislation is responsible for the costs of new construction being far higher than they need to be, since it is responsible both for artificially high wage rates and for feather-bedding practices in the construction industry. The expenditures of state and local governments for welfare and also for public education greatly add to the burden of property taxes. Artificially high construction costs and high property taxes place decent housing out of the reach of large numbers of Negroes. The housing problems of Negroes are enormously compounded by the existence of rent control, public housing, and urban renewal. Rent control is responsible for the radical deterioration and wholesale abandonment of buildings in the Negro slums in which it exists. The reason that rent control has particularly disastrous effects on Negroes is their poverty. As a result of their poverty, Negroes tend to live in neighborhoods in which land values are lower and in which the buildings are older and less valuable than in other neighborhoods. The consequence of these facts is that the rents paid in Negro neighborhoods tend to be much closer to the operating costs of landlords, such costs as fuel, maintenance, minor repairs, and taxes, than is the case in other neighborhoods. For the rents in the Negro neighborhoods do not have to cover the larger amounts of profit which would have to be made on more valuable land and buildings, nor do they have to cover the larger amounts of depreciation which would have to be charged on more valuable buildings. Now, in a period of inflation and rising property taxes, landlords' operating costs go up, and under rent control, landlords are compelled to absorb these increases. The consequence of rising operating costs and frozen rents is less money in the hands of landlords with which to make improvements and major repairs. When operating costs reach the point where they exceed the rents and no relief is in sight, It no longer pays a landlord to operate his building, and he abandons it. For he can no longer recover any portion of the money he has invested in the building, and continued operation only spells additional losses. The landlords in Negro neighborhoods have the least ability to absorb increases in operating costs because, as shown, their operating costs are initially closest to their rents. As a result, it is these landlords who are the first to stop making improvements and major repairs, and who are the first to abandon their buildings. Thus, it is Negroes who suffer most from rent control. Their housing deteriorates the most and is reduced in supply the most. In response to the housing problems created by its own policies, the government undertakes public housing and urban renewal programs. The effect of both is to raise the taxes of Negro working families and thus to make them still less able to afford decent private housing. Public housing quickly deteriorates into new slums because there is no profit and loss incentive to keep it otherwise. A private landlord is motivated to keep his investment as valuable as possible because it is his own money which he invests. Government officials have no such motivation. It makes no personal financial difference to them what kind of tenants move into the projects and what those tenants subsequently do to the premises. And even if it did matter to them as a question of principle, it would not be possible to give to public housing officials the discretion of a private landlord with respect either to the selection of tenants or to the making of repairs. Both must be done in accordance with prescribed legal procedures. Otherwise, there would be no way to prevent the officials from committing such acts as arbitrarily giving the apartments to their friends or squandering tax money on unnecessary repairs. The consequence of public housing is that Negro taxpayers pay higher taxes and receive new slums in place of old slums. Urban renewal is undertaken in major part for the purpose of replacing slum housing with improved new housing. It differs from public housing programs in that it applies to the rehabilitation of commercial and industrial areas as well as residential areas, and in that the new construction is frequently intended to be undertaken by private developers and to be privately owned. Under urban renewal, the government provides funds for the purchase and clearance of land in slums and funds for the making of certain site improvements on the cleared land, such as streets, water mains, sewers, and lighting systems. Subsequently, the land is generally to be sold or leased to a private developer. Now, because the urban renewal program makes a government organ the owner of land at a key stage of every project, it removes the incentive for putting the land to use. A private landowner paying interest on a mortgage cannot afford to let valuable land lie idle. Even if he owns the land free and clear and pays no interest, the knowledge of the income he forgoes makes him put his land to use as quickly as possible. But when a government agency owns land, there is no incentive to put the land to use. And the result has been that the average time required for executing an urban renewal project, from the time all planning has been completed to the time all construction is completed, is 8.5 years. In that period, of course, the supply of low-rent housing is reduced. Those displaced from the slum areas destroyed must crowd into the remaining slum areas, making them still more overcrowded. And as the urban renewal program grows, the amount of low-rent housing that is destroyed also grows. But what happens when the urban renewal projects are completed? Isn't the supply of low-rent housing restored at that point? The answer is no. Most of the new housing is luxury or semi-luxury housing. Thus, the effect of urban renewal is simply to deprive poor people of their homes. And among those poor people, of course, is a high concentration of Negroes. A discussion of the living conditions of Negroes under the mixed economy welfare state must explain the fact that prices in Negro neighborhoods tend to be higher than prices in middle-class white neighborhoods. The explanation is that the costs of doing business in the Negro neighborhoods are higher. What makes them higher is a higher crime rate, specifically higher rates of robbery and pilferage. If stores in the Negro areas are to remain in business, the customers must pay prices which cover all of the store owner's costs. Thus, they must pay prices which cover not only the cost of the goods which are sold to them, but also the cost of goods stolen or pilfered by others. These higher prices not only do not represent higher profits to merchants in the Negro slums, but very often do not compensate them for their higher costs. The fact that customers can shop outside the area places a limit on the ability of the merchants to raise their prices, even though their costs may have risen by much more. The result is that despite the higher prices in the Negro slums, merchants are moving out of Negro areas rather than moving in, as they would if the higher prices reflected higher profits. The result is that Negroes are deprived of stores in which to shop. The higher crime rate in the Negro slums is certainly not the result of anything innate in Negroes. With so many avenues of advance cut off by the mixed economy welfare state and surrounded by squalor, it is very easy for the individual Negro simply to give up. He is motivated to do so by the intellectual and artistic poison which comes to him from today's culture. The predominant message of today's books, movies, and other cultural media is that the individual's life is determined by forces beyond his control, that all of his failures are the result of the sins of society, and that it is pointless for him to struggle to achieve personal success. Because of the mixed economy welfare state, the personal experiences of Negroes are more likely to appear to confirm such beliefs than are those of whites, and to predispose them to such beliefs, even without exposure to today's cultural media. When understood in this light, the comparatively higher crime rate in the Negro slums is not a mystery. For when individuals give up on the possibility of achieving anything through their own efforts, drugs and crime appear to offer an escape. The actual solution to the problems of Negroes is quite different, however. All of the injustices which Negroes suffer are the result of laws representing the initiation of physical force. The solution to their sufferings is the total repeal of the mixed economy welfare state and the establishment of 100% laissez-faire capitalism. Today's intellectual establishment and today's Negro leaders, however, do not understand the nature of the problem. And the solution which they advocate is the further initiation of physical force. Thus, they advocate that the government compel the employment and promotion of Negroes and the achievement of racial integration by force. The effect of such measures is to intensify the very problem of prejudice against Negroes which they are intended to overcome. So long as there is an artificial job scarcity created by unions and minimum wage laws, the compulsory employment of Negroes means the compulsory unemployment of whites. So long as Negroes, for all of the reasons discussed, do tend to be less skilled, experienced, and educated than whites, their compulsory promotion over whites generally means the preferment of the less able over the more able. So long as whites do not want to live on a fully integrated basis with Negroes, the use of force against them increases their fear and resentment of Negroes. Thus, the use of force to counter the symptoms of prejudice places whites in a position in which they experience a conflict of interests with Negroes, in which injustices are committed against them in the name of Negroes, and in which they must fear and resent Negroes. Negroes, of course, are all too well aware of the growing hostility and resentment they encounter with every seeming success. By the nature of the means employed in their behalf, they cannot achieve what they want, which is to be accepted on their own merits as individuals. Indeed, they must view all of their gains with the suspicion of fraud. For example, can any Negro today know whether he holds his job because he has earned it in fair competition with other workers, or merely because he happens to be a Negro and is being used as window dressing by his employer? The sense that they are resented and can achieve no genuine success under the present social order makes a growing number of Negroes prone to consider desperate, irrational alternatives of a kind which further inflame prejudice against them, such as demands for a separate Negro nation or the establishment of a socialist dictatorship under Negro control. And the growing hostility of whites, meanwhile, holds out the possibility of legislative reversals for Negroes, such as might be triggered by a strong showing of George Wallace or of a similar presidential candidacy in the future. The effect of such reversals would probably be to drive the majority of the Negro population into the arms of the far left. And the effect of that could then easily be a civil war fought largely along racial lines. There is only one group which could gain from such a catastrophe, and that is the various communist factions of the old and new left. In their eyes, Negroes are a lumpen proletariat to be sacrificed in the cause of revolution. The first and most important step in halting and then reversing the forces which are pulling the country toward this terrible climax is simply making it known that the present racial conflict is the product of the mixed economy welfare state, and that the establishment of laissez-faire capitalism would achieve full justice and a harmony of the rational self-interests of all men. The mere recognition of this fact on a sufficiently wide scale would alone be enough to prevent any possibility of racial civil war or revolution, and to restore the spirit of reason to race relations. For it would give men the vision of a rational society toward which they could work by rational means. This knowledge must be disseminated among Negroes, and the prospects of its gaining acceptance among them are good. Many of them are already aware of the failure of the mixed economy welfare state. And when they realize how capitalism would work, it is difficult to see how they could prefer any other alternative. For the choice is between a system which rests on logic and reason, and which holds out the prospect of a nation enjoying the harmony of men's rational self-interests, and systems which offer nothing but emotion, violence, and destruction. Laissez-faire capitalism is the system which deserves the support of Negroes and of everyone who desires justice and prosperity for all men. Thank you.